will present some work on the fairness of machine-assisted human decisions, which is joint work with Talia Gillis, who's a professor at Columbia Law, and my student Bryce McLaughlin at Stanford GSB. So the theme of our research is about the fairness of algorithmic decisions. And as algorithms increasingly take high-stake decisions, we may be worried that they sometimes that their decisions sometimes have unintended consequences. So let me just give you one example here. So this is an article from the New York Times pointing out a challenge with the way that Apple Card is taking credit decisions. In this case, pointing to an example where two people who have very similar financial histories because they're married to each other and have joint financial lives, we see very different conditions from the specific application, and specifically the woman in this relationship receiving considerably worse credit conditions than the man, despite the two of them having a joint financial history. And so those kind of problems, of course, are not just limited to credit provision. Similar issues may arise in other high-stakes decisions where algorithms take decisions. Let me just give you some examples. For example, algorithms may do medical diagnoses, algorithms may set bail, or algorithms may take hiring decisions. And that has spawned a large literature, specifically in computer science, but also in related fields, on how we can define fairness in this, how we can diagnose bias, and how we can trade off fairness against accuracy. But the point of our paper is to say that there is something funny going on here, which is that all these pictures seem a little bit off. Because I would argue that in all three of those examples, it's not really the computer taking the decision. In the first example of medical decision-making, it may be a doctor taking a decision, taking some algorithmic advice under consideration. In the second case, it's still a judge taking a decision whether to release a defendant on bail. And in the final decisions, it's still a hiring manager who decides whether to hire somebody, but maybe they now rely partly on an algorithm. And so this raises the question how we can think about fairness of decisions if those decisions are not actually directly taken by the algorithm, which in our view is not even a decision that we can take as designers of the algorithm. It's not like we can decide that the algorithm should take the decision directly, but in many cases is even a legal requirement that there's still a human in the loop. And so what our point is to say that commonly fairness questions are analyzed through the lens of direct implementation, what we call automation. So we look at what an algorithm would do, how an algorithm would take decisions, and we're analyzing its predictions or decision. But in many, many application cases, algorithms, rather than deciding directly, provide assistance to a decision maker, and that decision maker retains the ultimate decision authority. And therefore, we are asking how the design of algorithms affect decision accuracy and fairness, and specifically how questions around fairness play out when the algorithm is not the main decision maker, but instead is providing assistance to a human decision maker. And what I will show you in this very short talk today is just a thought experiment of how this changes things. And then I will briefly summarize the result of an online lab experiment that we ran. And across those two, we will argue that there are some trade-offs that we often think of when we think of fairness. Specifically, we often think that there may be a trade-off where making an algorithm more fair, say, take more similar decisions across groups, may come at the cost of accuracy or may come at the cost of other decision qualities. And we argue that this is really specific to the case where the algorithm is deployed directly. And instead, I will show you some examples where this trade-off actually vanishes and where when we think of algorithmic assistance, excluding information from the algorithm and kind of changing the algorithm to take more similar decisions across groups may actually be costly both in terms of its accuracy and in terms of its fairness. Okay, so let me quickly mention that this, of course, plays against the background of a large literature in computer science. I just want to highlight one work that partly motivates what we're doing here, and specifically a study by Megan Stevenson and Jennifer Doliak, who study what happens when judges get access to algorithmic risk assessments that are produced by algorithms. And they document that these algorithmic risk assessments do change the sentencing that these judges do. At the same time, it seems to be that the judge decisions don't reflect some of the changes that were made to the algorithm in order to make the algorithm more fair or achieve certain policy goals. So while the algorithm seems to affect human decisions, it doesn't necessarily seem to affect them in the same way that we would conclude if we were to narrowly look at the algorithm. And for us, this raised this question of what happens if you look at the algorithm in context rather than in isolation. Sorry, my slides just jumped, so you will now have to see me quickly go through all the slides I'm about to show you. Sorry for that. Okay, so in order to quickly show you what the main idea of our work here is I'm first going to start with a toy model. I should warn you that will include some math, but then afterwards I will show you the numbers from a lab experiment that confirm the same story. So I can then tell the same story without as many formulas. Okay, so what's our main idea here? Our idea is that we have a human decision maker as well as a designer of the algorithm. The human decision maker we think of as an agent, because as economists, we like putting things into some model here where some agent takes decisions. So what is that decision that the agent takes? So think of this as being a hiring manager, and the hiring manager wants to assess the quality of different candidates that come through a hiring pipeline. So that hiring manager will observe information available of a candidate, which we assume includes gender information, or in general, some predicted characteristics, as well as some algorithmic assessment of the quality of that applicant. Based on that, that hiring manager takes a decision, maybe a scoring or maybe a decision whether to hire or interview somebody, and does so by using not just the information they are provided with, but also their subjective model or belief of the world. And in order to think about how algorithmic decisions affect their outcomes, we now assume that there is also a second agent, like a principal, who designs that algorithm. And an algorithm here, we think of basically a tool that summarizes complex data. So that maps some information about the individual to a prediction of how well that individual will perform. And here we just care about the distinction between two different ways of doing that. First, an algorithm that uses, that does not use gender information. So it is gender blind because we may be worried that there may be biases in the data or in the algorithm. And secondly, an algorithm that is group aware, meaning it takes decisions that may include gender information in its predictions. And we're now interested in understanding the difference between deploying one or the other algorithm. So in order to do so, we're also assuming that the agent, so the human decision maker, may have a different goal from the designer of the algorithm. We assume that the agent just cares about taking decisions that are as precise as possible, so that reflect their underlying belief, while the principal in our model wants to also trade that accuracy off against some fairness constraint, and specifically may not just be interested in how precise the algorithm reflects the true, say, ability of employees, but is also worried that some of these assessments may reflect biases by the algorithms or in the data, and therefore also cares about how different the assessments are across men and women, and wants to achieve an assessment that is as similar as possible across men and women, either overall or for men and women who have the same characteristics that I think are okay to use in my hiring decision. And I now want to show you in a simple example that the question whether we just look at the algorithm or we look at what happens if a human uses the algorithm can be very different. So what am I doing here? I'm now considering either an algorithm directly taking decisions or a human taking decisions with algorithmic input. And to do that, I'm keeping things as simple as possible. I just assume I have some training data and some belief about that. So the actual data I assume has some distribution. So I added some formulas down here that you can safely ignore. But if you're interested, you can look at our paper for details. And I have some beliefs. So my human decision maker believes that there are some differences in the ability of men and women at performing at the job they're hiring for. And the data may also have some differences that may either be spurious or they may be based on real differences across genders. And now I'm first going to consider what happens if an algorithm makes simple predictions here. So an algorithm making predictions is going to look at all the data they've seen in the past. In this case, let's assume that everybody is similar except for potentially gender. So think of this as we're already looking at people who are otherwise similar. And now an algorithm that doesn't use gender is just going to use past observations. It's going to make an educated guess based on that, how people perform. So based on past employees' performance, it's going to predict future employees' performance. But because I've not included gender here, there's not going to be any difference between men and women in the decisions that this algorithm takes. And now we're going to contrast that with an algorithm that instead of that uses predictions that are different by gender. So it averages last performances separately for men and women in order to predict future performances. And mechanically, of course, these predictions will be different in the future between men and women because I've used that gender information. But what happens if instead of an algorithm directly taking those decisions, I now have a human decision maker taking those decisions? Well, in this case, a human decision maker who only sees an overall average that does not distinguish between men and women may say, oh, this prediction does not actually include any information about gender differences. So I will use my belief about gender differences in order to adjust that, because I maybe, based on my experience, think that women are really not as good as men at performing this specific type of technical job. So therefore, I will adjust these predictions accordingly. And therefore, their prediction, their decisions will reflect whatever difference in beliefs they have, because they're not learning anything new about the differences across genders. On the other hand, if somebody sees an algorithm that actually uses gender and makes gender-specific predictions, our model suggests that that person may say, oh, these predictions are already very precise for this specific person. So they may include all the information, including about gender. So I will update about what I believed were differences in gender based on these predictions. And therefore, my decisions will reflect whatever differences there are in this data and according to this algorithm, but I may actually change what I believed to be the case. So if I have an agent having those two beliefs, then the implications are the following. Assume for the moment that the decision maker is really more biased than the data. So the real problem here is that people believe that women perform worse at this job than men. And it's not really a problem of the data. So if we are in this world, then if we give people group line predictions, yes, like if we were directly to apply the algorithm, that algorithm would be less different across men and women. But if we instead give that algorithm to a human decision maker, then that human's decision maker's decisions reflect their ex-ante bias. And that may translate into more differences across genders than if we instead use group aware predictions where we include gender, leading to lower disparities in the final decision. Right, let me now just show you that this is not just a hypothetical, but that this is something that can happen in practice, at least in our very stylized experiment. So I'm going to use the last 2 minutes here to just highlight the same story that I just told in formulas in a concrete experiment. So in this experiment, we had over 1,000 study subjects, and we asked them to assess other math test takers that we had taken from a previous study. And in that previous study, that were run by other researchers, specifically Cecilia Ridgway and Tamar Critchley-Cutts for some of their own research, people were asked to answer 6 math questions. And in our research, we now ask others to predict performance based on some information about those individuals. And specifically, we varied whether that information about individuals was related to the algorithmic predictions by gender or not. So in all cases, I would know whether an individual was a man or a woman, and I would know some information about their age and their education, but we varied whether the algorithm we used to make predictions about that included gender or not. So in one case, as is the case on the top here, the algorithm would not condition on age and would give predictions that don't consider gender. In other cases, as is the case on the bottom here, the algorithm would include gender and would give gender-specific predictions. So because I'm limited on time here, I will just give you the highlight findings here. So we now compared how did the assessment by our, if you want to, study subjects, which you thought of as basically somebody assessing somebody's job performance, in this case, their math ability, change depending on whether I give them gender blind or gender aware scores. So if I just looked at the assistant narrowly, then yes, the gender aware score was giving more different predictions. In this case, actually, women were evaluated higher because they performed on average better than men in our sample, while gender blind scores mechanically led to less differences. The actual averages showed that women performed higher on this math test. If instead I asked people to assess, these are the blue ones, then we saw that those individuals who were giving gender blind assessments thought that men were performing better than women, and had a negative bias against women. But if I gave them gender-aware information, meaning information that used the participant's gender, then this bias was overcome, and they overall gave similar scores to men and women with similar education and age backgrounds. Okay, so let me just summarize our paper. So we model a relationship between the design of algorithm and resulting fairness properties. We show that common trade-offs between fairness and accuracy can change when we look at the algorithm supporting rather than replacing human decision makers. And we provide evidence for that in a lab study. And so I think narrowly that adds another reason to be skeptical about just restricting inputs and saying we can achieve fairness by excluding characteristics. But more broadly, I think it shows a need for modeling context and bringing together work across disciplines in order to achieve fair outcomes, especially when this is not just about modeling algorithms, but also modeling how they interact with human decision makers. Thanks a lot.